Good afternoon, and welcome to the annual Crime and Justice Research Alliance Ask a Criminologist briefing. My name is Will Pelfrey. I'm a professor in the Criminal Justice Department and the Homeland Security Department in the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm proud to represent the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, the American Society of Criminology, and the Consortium of Social Science Associations as the organizer and moderator of this webinar. Usually, this briefing is held face-to-face in Washington, D.C., and it's intended to inform legislative decision makers, staffers, and policymakers about pressing criminology issues of the day. Because of current circumstances, we're holding this briefing this year as a webinar. We'll still have great information quality, and this webinar is available to anyone, anywhere. We're conducting this webinar via Zoom, and it's being live streamed on Kaltura. The live stream will be recorded and posted on the Wilder School's YouTube website. Our topic today is police and community relations in a time of crisis and unrest. This is a timely and important topic, and I'm very happy we can spend today addressing it. The federal government and many states are considering legislation on topics such as civilian review boards, qualified immunity, and changes in police accountability. These deliberations are the results of protests, movements, anger, and outcries stemming from the recent deaths of far too many persons at the hands of police. Here in Richmond, Virginia, we saw weeks of protests, and that's happened all over this nation. The protests have often been accompanied by conflict between persons and police, exacerbating the problem. I'm very happy to introduce our three panelists. They're all leaders in studying the intersection between the police and the community. Dr. Rod Brunson is the Thomas P. O'Neill Jr. Chair of Public Life and Professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and the Department of Political Science at Northeastern University, where he studies policy, policing, and procedural justice. He's published in, well, all of the journals. He served as PI or co-PI on many federal grants, and he's written some of my favorite articles on police and community issues. Dr. Jennifer Kobina is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, where she studies corrections, race, and police protests. She's the author of Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. This innovative and fascinating research, based on interviews with persons in these affected cities, demonstrates the importance of understanding the intersection between the police and the community. Dr. Everett Penn is professor of criminology at the University of Houston Clear Lake and the co-founder of TAPS, Teen and Police Service Center. His research areas include juvenile justice, race, and crime. TAPS trains hundreds of police officers each year on positive practices for interacting with youth, particularly vulnerable populations like young minority males. The panelists will present in the following order: Dr. Rod Brunson, Dr. Jennifer Kobina, and then Dr. Penn. Each panelist will present for about 12 to 15 minutes. We'll then have discussion, question and answer period. Audience members are invited to submit questions through the chat, or they can email them to me at wvpelfrey@vcu.edu, and I will pose the questions to the panelists. I'll post my email address as well as websites for all three panelists and our two sponsoring agencies, CJRA and COSSA, in the chat. I've talked enough now, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rod Brunson.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'm extremely honored to participate in today's discussion and look forward to hearing from and learning from my fellow panelists as well as audience members. Since George Floyd's untimely killing, the rallying cry to defund the police or downright dissolve departments has gained traction with several groups urgently pushing reform. While activist demands might understandably stem from profound fear and emotional fatigue regarding historical racial oppression, such definitions that are unclear, coupled with strategies that are ill-defined for divesting or abolition, are problematic. And against the backdrop of intense civil unrest and public outrage following incidents of alleged police violence, some police union leaders have asserted that officers are increasingly reluctant to carry out their sworn duties, fearing that lawful enforcement actions might result in unwarranted public scrutiny, harsh departmental discipline, and even politically motivated criminal prosecution. Moreover, Black citizens' longstanding mistrust of police and their renewed impassioned pleas for equal justice have been propped up by some antagonists as evidence of their unchangeable disdain for the police. Misrepresentations of lawful protest against police abuses as hatred potentially damages our nations and deepens our nation's partisan and racial divides, undercutting genuine opportunities for meaningful police reform. The collective harm resulting from unsupported claims regarding pervasive anti-policing sentiments among Blacks and veiled appeals to whites' racialized fear that increased crime will result from depolicing are especially dangerous for many law-abiding residents of disadvantaged Black communities, places where violent crime is disproportionately concentrated and effective policing efforts are desperately needed. Police-Black citizen relations are historically complex and fragile, requiring very nuanced analysis that humanizes both parties, a dimension sorely missing from contemporary policing discourse. Further, without intentional and thoughtful focus on police reform efforts, Black residents of disadvantaged communities will continue to be simultaneously plagued by over and under policing. In fact, it has become abundantly clear over the summer that reform efforts should be driven by police minority community partnerships, informed by evidence-based policies and oversights. And most of my comments this afternoon regarding over and under policing are based on a recently published, co-authored published article appearing in 2019 in Criminology and Public Policy, which I believe the link will be available to you in the chat. So thank you for the organizers for doing that. So our research team conducted face-to-face interviews with 108 New York City residents of Brooklyn and the Bronx, and we later restricted our focus to a subsample of 50 young Black men who were between the ages of 18 to 29, with a mean age of around 20. Now, these were residents of high crime neighborhoods who had considerable knowledge about illegal gun markets and the resulting bloodshed. And our set of findings confirmed that distress settings reliably failed to produce cooperative witnesses due to the cumulative impact of anti-snitching edicts, fear of retaliation, legal cynicism, and high-risk victims' normative views towards self-help. Almost half of our high-risk individuals in our sample reported having a friend or family member who were victims of gun violence, with an average of roughly knowing nine previous shooting victims, and 74% of our sample reported having been victims of gun violence themselves. This is a group clearly with extensive knowledge about New York City's illegal gun markets and the resulting violence. So effective policing is clearly vital to high crime communities, including and especially communities of color, and haphazard calls to defund the police are troubling. We found that members of high crime communities believe that sustainable public safety initiatives to focus on three things, all of which are aided by the police. The first is reducing gun violence. The second, using intermediaries to launch grassroots campaigns countering pro-violence and anti-snitching norms. And the third, and also equally important, improving police minority community relations. Again, almost half of our sample of high-risk individuals reported having a friend or family member who was a victim of gun violence, and knowing more than 9 shooting victims personally. And recall again that 74% reported having been victims of gun violence. So high-risk individuals, along with members of their kinship and friendship networks, have real-world reasons for not coming forth with information, which are often shaped by cultural and community dynamics, and also troubled by a widespread mistrust of police, which stems from over and under policing. And those dynamics continue to proliferate in high-risk, high-crime communities. So there is an urgent need for policies geared toward improving police effectiveness. And several of our respondents reporting having had firsthand negative police interactions, such as being threatened with violence, including potentially lethal violence. Many respondents expressed frustration with NYPD's emphasis on low-level crimes, arguing that the police were more interested in enforcing drug infractions or harassing residents of Black communities rather than apprehending those responsible for neighborhood violence. So to highlight, over and under policing can gradually chip away at police legitimacy. For example, community members who we spoke with reported frequently observing murder suspects walking through the neighborhood at the same time they saw police harassing community members for low-level minor offenses. More than half of our study participants pointed to widely publicized incidents of officer misconduct as justification for their entrenched mistrust, in particular nationwide coverage of fatal police shootings of unarmed Black citizens. Mistrust of the police is demonstrated in part by a lack of cooperation in shooting investigations. 92% of our respondents reported that they would not call the police if they or a loved one were ever threatened with gun violence. So members of high crime communities have little faith that the police will bring assailants to justice or protect them from future attacks. And it's interesting that respondents were not concerned about being caught by the police with guns. Instead, they were worried about being caught by enemies without them. Only 56% of African Americans have expressed having a great deal or a fair amount of confidence that police will act in their best interest. And this was reported in a recent poll in April 2020. And although there are imperfect measures for evaluating police performance, arrest rates reveal that few violent crimes are being solved, from as high as around 90% in 1960 to around 60% today. So killers of Black victims who make up a disproportionate amount of homicide events are the least likely to be arrested. And the prevailing view among Black citizens who I've spoken with over my 20 years of work in this area highlight that they believe that the police have an important role to play in controlling crime. However, they want to see a different kind of policing, one that recognizes and values their humanity. Members of high-risk communities want officers to be empathetic and show kindness and to not open otherwise mundane encounters with inflammatory profanity and aggression, such as unlawfully rifling through detainees' belongings. Our respondents wanted NYPD officers in particular to safeguard the futures of children in low-income neighborhoods as they would their own. Again, clearance rates for non-fatal shootings are low nationwide, implying that the police might benefit from cooperative relationships, including with members of high-risk communities. For example, in 2015, less than 10% of non-fatal shootings in Durham, North Carolina resulted in arrests. In 2017, only 1 in 10 non-fatal shootings were cleared in New Orleans, Louisiana. So this highlights the calls to defund the police are complex, and defunding the police would not address long-standing social problems of inequality and structural disadvantage that exists in many high crime communities. Residents of high crime neighborhoods complain about effective policing, including officers' rudeness, slow response time, and lack of compassion for crime victims at the same time that they decry ineffective policing. And a decrease in, or at least a divestment in policing leads to a small subset of chronic offenders perhaps to take the criminal justice system entirely out of the equation and take matters into their own hands. City leaders should embrace strategies that have been proposed that enlist the help of community partners with expertise and training that officers might lack, such as crisis intervention, mental health, homelessness, and substance abuse counselors. And engaging with the community might help highlight some of those complexities. So defunding the police might play out differently in different locations, of course. For example, one county might shift financial resources from the public safety budget to community stakeholders, and another might carelessly raid the police budget, further undermining agencies already struggling to meet public safety obligations. And the former scenario considers how best to reallocate limited resources, prioritizing persistent crime and disorder problems. Defunding the police may inadvertently sanction old age, structural inequality, and police agencies that serve low crime, affluent communities will continue to enjoy healthy operating budgets, and poor people living in high crime neighborhoods will have to unfortunately live with the consequences. Now to you, Dr. Kabina.
I want to thank everyone for being here. I'm certainly grateful for the opportunity to be on this webinar and learn from my colleagues, and I appreciate what Dr. Brunson had just stated. So today I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about what it means to take power away from the police and put it into the communities. So it definitely has a different lens than my colleague, Dr. Brunson. Acts of injustice against Black people, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, and countless others, are recent examples of the state violence that Black people have encountered historically in the United States. George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man, was murdered because a Minneapolis police officer pressed his knee into his neck for nearly 9 minutes, while 3 other officers did nothing to stop it, as Floyd begged for his life and pleaded for his mother. Amid a COVID-19 pandemic and an economic crisis, Floyd's killing sparked sustained protests across the country and around the world, as mass demonstrations have taken place to protest systemic racism, police violence, and broader structural inequalities. But violence, protests, and demonstrations are not new. In many ways, the massive demonstrations that have taken place resemble the protests that took place in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, following both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's deaths in 2014 and 2015. The deaths of both young Black men accelerated the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which emerged in 2013 after the murder acquittal of George Zimmerman and the death of Trayvon Martin, who at the time was a 17-year-old African-American boy. Because many African Americans were tired of the extrajudicial killings of Blacks by police and self-declared vigilantes, the movement unfolded as a call for action, demanding changes with how police officers deal with racial ethnic minorities and calling for an end to systemic racism that exists in this country. The deaths of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray were two of several high-profile police killings that gave impetus to the Black Lives Matter movement. And protests at each of these sites brought out decades of pent-up emotions of anger, outrage, and frustration from much of the Black community. The city of Ferguson was a flashpoint for nationwide protests since the killing of Michael Brown, who was unarmed and fatally killed by a white police officer from the Ferguson Police Department. 2 to 3 months following both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's deaths, I conducted nearly 200 interviews with protesters and residents of Ferguson and Baltimore. Large amounts of people took to the streets to protest because they believed that Michael Brown and Freddie Gray were victims of injustice and that these were not isolated incidents. Either they had been victims of racial profiling, surveillance, police harassment, or violence, or they knew family members or friends or neighbors or colleagues who were recipients of such acts by law enforcement. For example, Ebony was a Black resident in Ferguson who I interviewed. She stated, "I have a brother who I guess probably in the last 2 years he's been pulled over 24 times, and that's when he's coming to visit me. He doesn't live in the neighborhood. He's a professional. He drives a very nice vehicle, but every time he's being harassed. The police ask him, 'Are you a drug dealer? Where did you get your money?' Slamming him down on the streets for no apparent reason. He's not breaking the law and he committed no infractions, just driving while Black." So residents explicitly tied their involvement in protesting to these broader patterns of criminalization that have led to heightened police scrutiny of Black civilians. In addition, many felt an overwhelming obligation to demonstrate, as they understood that failure to do so would result in more Black people dying at the hands of the police. And so as a result, approximately 2/3 of people in my study who protested back then had done so for the first time. Among the activists that I interviewed, the desire to achieve change and put an end to police violence and systemic racism were central factors to protest participation. However, it was not uncommon for protesters on the front lines to become recipients of repressive or aggressive militaristic police tactics. Though thousands of people took to the streets to protest treatment by the state, the government sent more police with high-powered weapons and military tanks. Law enforcement used tear gas, rubber bullets, physical force, armored vehicles, and large-scale arrests on demonstrators. And protesters viewed these actions as acts of aggression intended to intimidate. Those who protested on the front lines and were more vocal about denouncing police brutality and who challenged the authority of law enforcement were more likely to denounce police violence, and they were more likely to experience and witness repressive police actions. For instance, Trayvon, he was a Black protester who lived in Ferguson, stated that while he was peacefully protesting, the police started to shoot tear gas. They shot so much of it, like 50 or 60 gas canisters. And plus I got shot by a rubber bullet by the police. I'd say I passed out for about like 20 minutes. And Trayvon admitted afterwards, "I was basically scared to freaking go to sleep, because how would they just shoot at innocent people in a crowd? And now what if they were shooting live rounds? I could have been dead." So there were some protesters who were impacted by the physical and psychological trauma of these coercive police tactics. And similar to the unrest we've witnessed take place this summer, in the midst of protesters decrying the killings of Black individuals by law enforcement, many continue to experience heavy-handed military tactics used on them, despite the fact that the vast majority of protests were and have been peaceful. In fact, in many cases, violence has been catalyzed by police tactics, and we know that force begets force. Despite having experienced state-sanctioned violence. Those who remained committed to the movement were insistent on remaining active in protesting to bring about change. Others, however, were deterred from engaging in subsequent street protests because of the coercive ways that authorities policed demonstrators. And yet, even amid that, many people I interviewed adapted different ways to stay motivated and engage in the overall ideological goal of the Black Lives Matter movement. Some organized and strategized behind the scenes, some became grassroots organizers, others became much more civically engaged, and some became social justice advocates. And ultimately, the more repressive the police were, the more some protesters developed resistance and became much more civically engaged in an effort to root out systemic racism and put an end to police violence that continued to rob many Black individuals of their lives. So amid America's long history of state-sanctioned violence against Black Americans reflect persistent inequities within the criminal legal system. Many have called for reinvestments of federal dollars to education, employment, and social services in marginalized communities, which has been shown to improve community safety. The whole idea behind defunding the police reflects a desire for a massive restructuring of public spending priorities. And specifically, it calls for permanent reductions to existing policing. And such calls are made for several reasons. First, we've tried to figure out various ways to train the police, from implicit bias training to diversity training to de-escalation training. And although calls for police training always seem to follow controversial police-civilian encounters, we know virtually nothing about the short or long-term effects associated with police training of any type. But statistics show that more than 1,000 men, women, and children are killed each year by the police, and thousands more are brutalized and abused. Moreover, many police reform advocates also believe that diversifying the police force will reduce police violence against individuals of color, particularly Black Americans. However, my research and other research suggests that increased representation in and of itself is not necessarily the answer. Around a quarter of the people I spoke with in Baltimore and Ferguson who reported having personal encounters with Black officers also reported that Black officers operate aggressively when they encounter Black civilians. Moreover, at the time of Freddie Gray's death, just over half of the police department were officers of color. However, the Department of Justice published a blistering report concluding that the Baltimore Police Department engaged in a pattern of unconstitutional, racially biased policing. This came despite Baltimore having made efforts to attract and promote minority candidates. And evidence suggests that hiring racially diverse police force on its own will not solve the problems of reducing police violence. Second, nationwide, only 5% of all arrests made in 2018 involved alleged violent crimes, and only 4% of police officers' time involves a violent crime. The vast majority of arrests are for low-level, nonviolent activities and encounters that sometimes escalate to deadly force. These activities are often symptoms of underlying issues of drug addiction, homelessness, and mental illness, which should be treated by healthcare professionals and social workers rather than the police. Third, the clearance rate for violent crime is abysmal. The FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program shows that about 40% of homicides go unsolved, 66% of rapes go unsolved, 70% of robberies go unsolved, and nearly 50% of aggravated assaults go unsolved. Fourth, the number of police officers do not correlate with the city's crime rates. Over the past 60 years, more spending on state and local police has not significantly correlated with less crime or more crime. The real issue is how police departments are deployed and scheduled. It is more important what the officers do versus how many of them there are. And finally, America spends more than $100 billion on policing each year. According to data from the Urban Institute, from 1977 to 2017, state and local government spending on police increased from 42 billion to 115 billion. And while at the same time, there have been cuts to social services, education, community resources, and services. Police departments are usually the largest department in a city budget and usually take anywhere from 25 to 50% or more of the general funds in major cities. Ultimately, outsized spending increases on policing are draining resources from everything else. So the idea behind defunding the police is that there should be massive restructuring of public spending priorities. While defunding has been quite controversial, there are some commonalities between police and activists when it comes to reimagining the role of police. The reality is that we depend on police to solve every societal problem. We look to the police to solve issues of abuse, abandonment, homelessness, unemployment, domestic disputes, school disruption, and a host of other societal problems. And many officers will admit that we unfairly look to them to solve all societal ills and that they're not well equipped to deal with issues, for instance, pertaining to drug overdoses and mental health addiction. Calls to 911 for mental health crisis and problems related to homelessness, substance abuse, and petty interpersonal disputes consume huge amounts of policing resources and can lead to violence, repetitive cycles of 911 calls, and imprisonment because underlying problems do not get solved. For instance, Jerry, he was a Black protester who lived in Baltimore, and he has stated that education is a central priority in neighborhoods. However, at the time of the interview in 2015, he stated that there was a multi-million-dollar defunding of education. It just happened in the city of Baltimore, and within the context of 2 casinos being built. The money, it was promised for education, but the governor cut it and then turned around and wants to build a $30 million youth jail. He went on to say that there's this defunding of programs, recreational centers are being closed, schools are being closed themselves, and then there's the firing of teachers. But the priorities of the city are misaligned with the needs. Calls to defund the police are simply about moving taxpayer dollars away from harmful police practices to more human-centered services that work to keep our communities safe and help them to thrive. As criminologists, we know what works to reduce crime and despair. If we want to prevent juvenile justice involvement, then we need to support families. If we want to prevent drug overdoses, then we need to provide drug treatment. If we want to prevent homelessness, then we need to provide affordable housing. If we want to prevent joblessness, then we need to provide more jobs. If we want to prevent poverty, then we not only need to provide jobs that offer a living wage, but help people to maintain their income. We know what needs to be done to reduce crime, and calls to defund the police entails reallocating or redirecting resources away from the police department to other government agencies funded by the local municipality. That includes investing in high quality public schools, clean and affordable housing, mental health care, the creation of living wage jobs, and social programs. It means relying less on the state to handle societal problems and instead rely more heavily on social workers, therapists, educators, and medical workers. Reliance on police to do far more than they are trained or even capable of doing sets up police and society for failure. Government should be thinking about how to give communities resources so they do not have to call the police for every societal problem. In communities that have low crime rates, we do not see heavy police presence. These neighborhoods are well off, well connected, and well resourced. In contrast, communities that have high rates of crime see structural disadvantage, pervasive inequality, joblessness, poverty, and inadequate public services. Increased efforts should be made to diminish economic deprivation by promoting stable housing, rehabilitating deteriorated houses, enhancing social and physical disorder, improving municipal services, and building human capital. These kinds of investments within marginalized communities can aid in reversing concentrated disadvantage and ultimately stabilizing neighborhoods. And when we see large investments into marginalized communities, when we place large investments in marginalized communities, it will play a potent role in crime reduction and prevention and ultimately reduce our need to heavily rely on law enforcement in the first place. In addition, so much more needs to be done to change the accountability structure within policing departments. Jada, for instance, a Black protester in Ferguson, stated, "I'm looking forward to a day where maybe the bad cops can be weeded out. I haven't really heard of any cops being indicted and convicted for police brutality. They need to be held accountable." One step that can be taken to hold police officers accountable is to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020. The House of Representatives recently passed this bill, and it is the most progressive and comprehensive police reform that we've had in American history. It is a bill that holds all law enforcement officials accountable for their actions. It ends qualified immunity for police officers such that individuals can recover damages in civil courts when police officers violate their constitutional rights. It ends racial and religious profiling. It bans chokeholds and no-knock warrants. It establishes uniform policies for the use of force such that it would result in change use of force standards from reasonable, which is quite vague and unclear, to necessary. It would require body-worn cameras. It mandates data collection on police encounters, and it ultimately limits the transfer of military equipment to local and state police departments. Because so many demonstrators were subject to coercive military tactics while peacefully protesting, it is essential to demilitarize the police by not just limiting, but banning the federal transfer of military-grade weapons, tactical equipment, and vehicles to local police forces and end militarized training programs. That way, protesters like Trayvon, who was tear gassed and shot at with rubber bullets, can be spared physical and psychological trauma. I encourage government at all levels, local, county, state, and federal, to commit fully to fulfill the social contract each has with their citizens. That is to be committed to advancing health and the well-being of all by acting to address structural racism and shift resources from policing to address public health and promote economic opportunity. Thank you. So at this point, I will go ahead and pass this on to Dr. Penn.
Thank you so very, very much. What a stimulating conversation that we're having, and we're not even halfway through. I'm Dr. Penn, and if we could, coming to you from Houston, Texas, that if we could take a moment of silence, because just yesterday, the Houston Police Department lost a 41-year veteran, a friend of mine, Sergeant Harold Preston, who was killed in the line of duty responding to a domestic violence case, and this being Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Again, it's an honor to be here today, to be amongst such an esteemed panel of colleagues in discussion. So I thank the panelists and our hosts for today. I am able to stand on the shoulders of the panelists and so many criminologists, as I consider myself one who moves in both worlds, the academic world and the practitioner world, who applies theory to practice, as so much of the theory and research has been presented today that almost moves a person to say, what can we do? What is the response? We hear from some that say defund, we say from some to increase funding. But we need to find where we are, where we stand right now, so that we can look for the best models of theory to practice. We are certainly aware of the mistrust and injustice that exists as African American, Latino, the poor deal with the police and the aspects of police oppression and aggressiveness. We have seen many task forces, police commissions, presidential commissions, reports just here in Houston, for example. We finished our report with the suggestions that should take place. But we need to look to understand what has already been presented, and then look for what solutions are viable or are in place at this time. I'm very happy to tell you that in Houston, Texas, we have the Teen and Police Service Academy. So again, understand I'm going to move in two worlds here, that of applying theory to practice. And I could not be here without the outstanding work of colleagues such as Brunson and Cabana on this panel and so many others. But the Teen and Police Service Academy started here in Houston, Texas in 2011, is a U.S. Department of Justice cooperative agreement 2011 CKWKK 009 that brought together the Houston Police Department, the University of Houston Clear Lake, Texas Southern University, and the Houston Independent School District. Almost textbook of those community aspects coming together to respond to an issue. And during this time frame of 2011, one has to go back to the economic hardship that so many cities were facing, 2008, 2009, 2010, with the Great Recession. So as I'm told, as the story is presented to me, is that at that time, Chief Charles McClellan of the Houston Police Department, first year as the chief of Houston, was given information that there was this federal grant. He gathered his assistant chiefs together and said, unfortunately, we've had to eliminate or reduce programs such as GRAPE, DARE, POWS, and others. One of the first that are cut from any budget related to policing are those service programs, those community programs. He asked his police chiefs, his assistant chiefs, to look at these grant opportunities. He and one did. Assistant Chief Brian Lumpkin. He immediately called me, and we then forged a relationship of practitioner, academic, working together, knowing the problems of the city, walking step by step, hand in hand, to look at these issues of trust, race, injustice existing in the city. We put together a proposal that was accepted, and we created what is now the Teen and Police Service Academy. We grew from understanding DARE, GREAT, and other programs to understand that we needed to create something that goes to the most at-risk, at-promise youth in the city. Those that have already had the negative experience of dealing with the police department, vicariously have perhaps had or been told about that experience, and continue to foster feelings against the police department. But we also knew we had to create a program that would educate police officers. That we know police officers walk around with biases and thoughts just like everyone else. How can one create a balance that would allow for both sides to come together, interact with each other, and allow for better understanding? The Teen and Police Service Academy said, look, we're going to find those at-risk youth, and our very first program was in the alternative high school for Houston. That's where we wanted to go. We saw from the DARE and GREAT some models, some more successful than others, but we said to ourselves, we're going to train our officers up with a minimum of 6 hours for each officer. The officers are selected by the police department to be the best representation of that police department and move them to an opportunity to build bridges, reduce the social distance between the most at-risk youth population and that of the police department. To be these, if you will, these ambassadors that have the skill of listening and talking and expressing to make for better relationships. In the course of the Teen and Police Service Academy, you have to understand that we put together modules that take on the subjects, the very subjects that the panelists before me talked about, everything from conflict mediation, police and youth interaction, substance abuse, human trafficking, drug interaction, simply giving an opportunity for the youth to ask questions, and not ask questions from the back of a police vehicle or while being harassed, but while equal footing exists so that both parties can understand why things are done. I think of one of the points that has been brought up by one of the students asking, why do you come to my mother's car with your hand on my gun? Now, jokingly, that police officer, a TAPS officer, said, because my gun belt is heavy. But that may have been said to be funny, but it at least allowed for the opening of conversation so that that youth and that police officer can have an opportunity for the youth to understand the feelings the police officer has coming to the car, and for that police officer to understand the feelings the youth has when he or she does come to the car. And you know what we find? That the relationship of fear is very, very strong. That when you have the opportunity to train and interact with our police officers out there, you will find that fear does play a lot into what they do. Just by understanding that allows for you to take on the difference and see the persona as a protection of self rather than perhaps as aggressive as we may see it. But we do not let them out with that as easily as you may think. These youth get on them. These are youth that do not hold their tongue, that allow for honest conversations to take place. What holds us together is knowing that our mission is to reduce the social distance between the most at-risk youth and law enforcement. Our theoretical foundation holds itself into the findings of 1920s, 1930s, Borgadas, and even more modern to that of social bond theory with Hershey and so many others. That if the idea of us spending time with those we don't understand, those we don't know, those we don't trust, by allowing us to have interactions with those people, we can better understand their motivations, their drives, and why they do what they do. Just think of today. We have been talking for about the last 40 minutes. You now know me better than you did just a few minutes ago. The panelists a lot better. Just imagine the interaction that's taking place when you have an academy such as TAPS Academy that takes place for 11 weeks, about 2 hours every time for this interaction to take place in subject matters that are most profound to those, the youth and the officers. Is it easy? It is not. Our first day of TAPS Academy is a day that will constantly stay in my mind, as we've had dozens of academies. But I can remember, for example, being in one Harris County juvenile facility where there was the room with 4 or 5 officers in it, fully uniformed without their weapon, and the class of youth, of male youth, anywhere in the age of 13 to 16 years of age, were brought in. Physically, 2 or 3 of the young men could not bring their legs to move forward into the classroom. Physically, they could not. They remembered the horrific experiences they have had in life interacting with police officers. Even though they were in a secure juvenile facility, persons were all around them, they could not bring themselves to go into the TAPS Academy classroom on that very first day. They would return the second and third week and move to, no, not sending Christmas cards to each other, but yet moving to mutual appreciation and respect, to understand you're doing your job, I'm doing my thing. Let's find out what we can find and learn from each other. So yes, there is hard work that's done, selecting the officers, training the officers, moving them past some of the biases that they have, and understanding where they're coming from both sides is what we do. Well, one of the problems that we had as we grew, 2012, 2013, was that we found that schools, the most at-risk schools, at-promise schools, wanted to have such a program, but did not have the time to fit it in their school day. So as I present this, I present a solution here, is that we then took our curriculum to the Texas Education Agency in Austin and had them review it. They reviewed the curriculum and awarded TAPS Academy the opportunity to teach a course called Teen Pole, which grants 1 high school credit for every student upon completion. Look what we're doing there. We're taking issues of truancy, taking issues of class credit, putting them together with the opportunity to bond better with police officers, learn life skills, and at the same time instruct officers better than any training class that could ever take place, in which officers stagnantly sit for 4 hours, 6 hours, and 8 hours, listening to someone tell them what they should do, where the mouths of these young men and women tell them what they ought to do, what needs to take place in order to make for better relationships, what needs to take place if they do want to improve their conviction rate, their arrest rate, helping them to understand in the true nature of moving community policing to 21st century policing. As the task force says, having the most disenfranchised people involved. You can't get more disenfranchised than the African-American or Latino young man who despises being around the police, but now through TAPS Academy, and I'm sure other programs, has an opportunity for his or her voice to be heard and allow for that discussion to take place in order to make communities safe and to have active listening and active response. So this 1 credit allows for this to take place and build upon the TAPS Academy model of active listening, active participation, and of course, earning that 1 credit. We then ran into another problem. Student could be in our TAPS Academy class, student could be in the Teen Pole class, but there is an ending. What do you do then when you've built relationships where the student goes from perhaps giving a 1-finger wave to the police officer to a 5-finger wave to police officers, moves from not speaking to police officers, moving more to, hey, let me talk with you and understand and have some conversation. So we created TAPS clubs. TAPS clubs allow for that relationship to continue. Remember, I'm talking about the most at-risk youth that already have involvement in the justice system, grades behind, issues of pregnancy, substance abuse. That's all the students that we deal with. So please don't be taken to believe, oh, this is just another DARE great program. Wonderful programs that give us nuggets of information to move forward, but we go to the most disenfranchised group. So we started TAPS clubs coming from students who were finishing up and graduating from TAPS Academy program. And from that, you move them to leadership roles in their high school to then be the directors of the clubs. These directors of the clubs hear the sounds, the voices, the concerns of those students, and move to bring together topics to allow for peer-to-peer learning to take place. They are the people in that high school who would talk about Domestic Violence Month, set up a table, speak on the loudspeaker to other fellow students to inform them about conflict mediation, a police career, and other opportunities. Speaking with their police officer mentor, if you will, who comes in to provide the training to allow for them to be those great instructors to their fellow classmates in the school. I hope that it's becoming clear that we should not see this time frame as a dismal period in history, but as a great opportunity for us to bring together theory, research, and practice to move forward with policing and relationships for youth and citizens in the United States. Here in Texas, we did another thing. We had the opportunity to say, as Sandra Bland and so many others around the country had difficulty with policing, what are we going to do? So our legislative session in 2017 came together, put together what was originally going to be a class for 9th graders, but then moved itself to understand, why are we only educating 9th graders? We need to make sure that police officers and youth are being trained at the same time, that the lessons are just not finger pointing to youth and to citizens, that we do some of that finger pointing also to that of officers. So in 2017, the Texas legislature passed what is now known as the Community Safety Education Act of Texas. This act in 2017 looked at, modeled, if you will, or heard the call of what TAPS Academy is able to produce and moving forward, youth and police working together, a mandatory class for all of the peace officers in the state of Texas, 80,000 plus, all high school seniors, mandatory for class of 2021, those applying for their driver's license, and those receiving corrective driving education. Notice what I said, all of those populations required to receive the same course. And what is that course? Learning what is the Community Safety Education Act and why it's important, some history as to why it was brought forth, learning the 7 steps of a traffic stop, learning procedures during a traffic stop, and look at this, also learning how to file a compliment or a complaint after a traffic stop. Mandatory for all 80,000 peace officers, high school seniors, and those who are applying for their driver's license or receiving corrective driving education. I think we have opportunities here. These opportunities allow us to move forward and say to ourselves, through this theory and research, that we can make differences and move forward. Some may say, all right, I hear your program, TAPS Academy, wonderful, 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 but what does it mean for numbers? What does it actually mean for outcome? When we look at it, we have our numbers that indicate that the number of youth that say they do not respect the police, and this is interesting, when we hold the training session, we ask the question in the training session to the officers, the percentage that you believe these most at-risk, at-promise youth would say % do not respect the police. Most answers say 70, 80, 90%. It is only 55%. So I think there's another point there that we need to realize. It is not the entire population of at-risk, at-promise youth, Black youth, Latino youth that hate the police. Let's be very, very careful with that. Although there is that of a majority, it is not all. When they finish TAPS Academy, about 10% say that they do not respect the police. 81% said they do not feel close to police. We see those numbers move to 44%. 80% saying that they do not feel police will treat them fairly. 25% say that upon completion of TAPS. So we do have numbers. We look forward to holding in more rigorous way. Our testing of our program was planned for this fall, but unfortunately COVID-19 said no to that. But we also, in final point, take time to ask the police officers. Remember, we think of police officers and youth as equal. So if we're going to ask questions to the youth, we need to ask questions to those officers. And it's a very interesting concept that emerges from asking the police officers pre and post test involvement with TAPS Academy. For example, we find that, yes, they seem to be very concerned or somewhat concerned about the youth that are involved in TAPS Academy. Remember, these officers are selected, are screened to be the very best representation of the police force. But interesting enough, upon post-test, after completing TAPS Academy, we find that there is a rise from these officers of saying that they feel somewhat disconnected or very disconnected. It's because they get to know these youth. They get to know the community more than arrest and negative encounters. They find out some of the difficulties, as mentioned before, that are occurring in these communities. They get the opportunity then to tell that other officer during roll call and other circumstances what's going on in communities. For my police officer friends out there who are concerned about the safety of the officers, there is no concern to have here. Indeed, we understand police safety and security, but we're also interested in the youth safety and concern. So understanding this and understanding where we stand today, I think we have opportunities. And I look forward to the question and answer session that we're going to have as theory and practice comes together for our future, not just for our police officers, but for our youth and for the communities in which those police officers serve. Thank you.
Thank you to all three panelists. These were very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. There's a lot of really good information there. A number of important themes emerge regarding the role of the police, how citizens or residents interact with the police, and some important recommendations for future legislation, policy initiatives, and research. Dr. Brunson talked about resident trust or mistrust of the police and the findings of his study. A link and the citation to his work can be found in the chat. Dr. Cabina described findings from her interviews, and she also articulated what I think is a powerful call to action. And I posted the title of her book in the chat. Dr. Penn talked about his work with youth and police in the TAPS Academy, and I posted the TAPS Academy link in the chat. So please pay attention to the chat room. As Dr. Penn's colleagues at TAPS worked towards a mutually acceptable path towards peaceful communities. And he talked about what I interpreted as humanizing both police and residents. That's an important point. We have a number of questions submitted through the Q&A process and through the chat, and I'll be posing them to a specific panelist for answers. And once that panelist provides an answer, any panelist is welcome to contribute to that answer, or we can move on to another question. And we've got a number of questions. So the first question is for Dr. Brunson, and that question asks, is defunding the police about putting responsibility back to other services, mental health services, for example, and taking money away from police, or should it be about refocusing police, that is better training, better preparedness to provide services needed in the community? And how do police leaders move towards this end?
Great question, thank you. I think the broader conversation, and I think this was shown through the nuanced perspectives that my colleague, Dr. Cabina, and myself have, and that I am not necessarily opposed to shifting resources or doing critical assessments of what police are best equipped and trained to do. I think that sometimes the funding conversations become so broad and unmanageable, and that they are seemingly a knee-jerk response sometimes because of people's long-standing and honest dissatisfaction with the policing that they've received. So I would caution, given what I hope to have highlighted, that there are some very dangerous, high-profile, high-crime communities with chronic offenders who otherwise law-abiding citizens in those communities need to be protected from, and that defunding the police, a short-sighted view of defunding the police without taking those things into consideration, are the things that I find troubling, leaving people who are already underprotected even less secure in their personal safety. So I think that police certainly have a role to play, as Dr. Penn has said, and that we need to humanize all parties and to come together and work collaboratively to help to understand what are the demands and dynamics of the communities, and how can we work together to solve some of those longstanding problems that exist in broader society as well.
Great, thank you.
I would like to
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment, because I think Dr. Brunson definitely raises an important point that what we don't want is that the most vulnerable communities, are become even more vulnerable to harm or violence. I think what I really just want to emphasize too is just that we know police officers in general are overburdened by various types of tasks that can be handled by different people in government. Again, as I mentioned, officers are required, much of their time is spent with dealing with non-violent issues, dealing, for instance, even with vehicle accidents, filling out reports, non-violent calls to people's homes. I think this is important to know, because 9 out of 10 calls for services are really non-violent. And so if we ultimately limit officers' roles to dealing with investigation and serious types of crimes, with the hopes that would actually improve the clearance rates, and at the same time, by even reducing the budget 5-10% in some cases, can do prove to be show quite a bit of inroads for actually being able to meet the needs of the community. It can't just be reducing the police budget. It has to be reinvesting in communities that have not already been invested in the first place. Because again, we know some of the structural problems, structural issues that lead to crime. And so if there's effort to use those dollars to address the root cause of crime, right? Because we know crime is really symptomatic of larger societal problems. And in these neighborhoods where we see high crime, not surprisingly, we are seeing high rates of poverty and unemployment, high rates of underemployment. We're seeing poor quality schools, lack of resources. So this is really an attempt to try to reallocate dollars, redirect dollars, such that the communities that are most in need are now having their needs met in the same way that other communities, like middle-class, affluent communities, are already well-resourced and well-connected.
Thank you. Those are both great answers. And the calls to defund the police really make us think about where money goes. And both Dr. Brunson and Dr. Kabina talked about how money can be allocated to services that will best serve the public. And that's what police want. Police go into the field to serve the public. And the best path for serving the public is what virtually all criminal justice professors like us and professionals want to pursue. There were several questions posed about the TAPS program, and I'm going to route one of those to Dr. Penn. One participant asked in the chat room, the fact that officers have to be screened to represent the best of the force to participate in the program. How does that bias the results of your work through TAPS?
It is biased. There's only one way to put it. In early TAPS Academy, we thought that the process of openly asking officers to participate, almost volunteering officers to participate would be a good practice. We have found that the vital minds of the youth cannot be exposed to some officers that just don't get it. I mean, we could talk all that we want this next hour about police officers, and usually somewhere along the line in these conversations, someone's going to make the statement, 99%, 95% of the officers are good, but 5 to 1% of them are not. Well, you tell that to George Floyd and his family, because all of those officers on that day, 100% were not good. So we have found not every officer is cut out to be the ambassador to spend time and build relationships with youth. We have found that out. So if that's the case, we must put our best foot forward. We must put our best A-team forward, screen them, train them to be the very, very best, and hope that the spillover effect of these officers that are TAPS officers will make its way to those officers who are receiving the de-escalation training, as good Jennifer has talked about there, and all these others, more opportunities to learn and reduce their social distance. But as one who has taught thousands of police officers, I can tell you that training is training. Just as we have students that sit in our classrooms and somehow manage to get a B or an A, there are there are officers who are able to finish a course, sign their name at the beginning at 8 o'clock, leave for lunch, sign their name again at 4 o'clock for the completion of the class, and nothing has changed. We have to understand and appreciate that. Does that mean you stop training? It does not. But it just means that you look at as many opportunities as possible to change those biases and stereotypes. And a model that could work is that of hearing from the mouths of youth that these officers can learn. I won't use some of the names that some officers use, that they're not those people. I mean, just think of the reality of a police officer who may come from a different environment, a different place, hops in a shop, a police car for 8 hours and sees people at their very worst for 8 hours. No one calls the police to say, I just got an A on the test or I got my mortgage approved. You don't call the police to tell them that. You call the police on your very worst day. Someone has broken into my house, someone has stolen my car, someone has hit me, and that's what the police officer sees. So the mind of that police officer is, I spend my day with purple people. Purple people have these problems, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. I see that these purple people are just problems of A, B, C, and D, and see that, and then that person takes that at home every day, day after day for his or her career, and that moves to be his or her reality and actions in dealing with those people. Giving opportunities to reduce that social distance allows for that to change. So referring back to the question, let me just say we have found it is best to select and be biased to make sure that the best officers are being presented in front of our young men and women.
That's a great answer, and I'm gonna look for purple people. But the answer that you talked about reminds me of all the research on corruption and police malfeasance, and all that literature says consistently that a few bad police can make police around them also bad. The converse has to be true as well, that some good police can make police around them good and better. And I love the idea that you espoused, which is work with some police, maybe they're the best police, and help them to identify the ideal path forward, and then expect them to go out and be ambassadors, not just in their communities, but also with their agents. We've all worked with police for years, and I've seen police do things that were really disappointing, and I've seen police do things that were amazingly selfless acts and generous of their time and spirit, and that's what we want to encourage. One audience member posed a question that I think is a really interesting question, and I'm going to direct it to Dr. Brunson. The question is, police departments are registering record retirements and separations. Many agencies are finding it hard to fill open positions. Morale in policing is low. Among things like calls to defund police and current news coverage of police. How do we convince potentially good officers to pursue a career in policing under current circumstances?
Thank you. Let's say one thing I want to add, and I suspect that Dr. Penn and Dr. Kavina share this view that we often don't highlight, is that in the same way that we say that the vast majority of police officers are good and noble, the vast majority of citizens, even those living in high crime, challenged communities, are good and noble as well. And I think that that deserves recognition. And that part of the recognition also extends to the question in that we have to have a different orientation to who we attract to the profession. And if we have the mentality that police officers are actually public servants and they're actually there to do good, and that they are socialized, trained, monitored, and held accountable to providing that level of service to all citizens, regardless of their demographics and characteristics, then we may attract a different, maybe we're not attracting the same sort of recruits or the same type of recruits that were previously interested in the profession, but maybe that's not a bad thing. And maybe we need to highlight that the policing profession, as many professions, have changed, and that maybe requires a different set of skills that we previously didn't value or prioritize, and certainly in the policing profession haven't rewarded. That we reward the types of things that, stereotypically interest people in policing. And we look at training brochures and recruitment brochures, we see the kind of militarized weaponry and things that Dr. Cabina has spoken about, but we don't see we don't see outreach in terms of helping communities, assisting people with dire social conditions, et cetera. So I would say that maybe it's a good thing that there's a shift and that there's a lack of excitement, enthusiasm to the traditional candidate or recruit. And maybe, as Dr. Penn has said so eloquently, this is an opportunity for us to reimagine policing. And part of that reimagining is reimagining what the ideal recruit looks like.
Great, thank you. It's a difficult topic, and it's something that police agencies struggle with regularly. People go into policing not to get rich; they go in to help their community, and sometimes that's a very difficult task. But we hope that they are able to maintain that original mindset, that original intent as they work through policing. Somebody that we know, Dr. Lee Ross, posed a question for Dr. Penn. Can you provide an update on some of the success stories among Academy graduates from TAPS?
Oh, indeed. Thank you, Lee. Good to hear from you. And again, I hope I see you sometime soon. I tell you what, the stories are just phenomenal. We'll be coming out with our book, Police and Youth, next year. But the stories that come to my mind are those that are not the triumphant, this person has gone to XYZ college or this and that. They come from the little successes. You have to remember, we're going to see on the first day that youth who has a home that is in disarray, who has parents that may not be in the home, and move them through teaching life skills and trusting police officers, as police officers need to learn to trust the youth, to an acceptance level of being a functional member of society. Little things, like I remember we had a police car display, and the youth had an opportunity to look at the police car display, and some of them sat up front. And I remember one youth saying, "This is my first time sitting up front in a police car. I like the view up front than that of what's in the back." I mean, that's powerful right there, because you've given an opportunity for a different view. The officer has opened up his world, her world, to show the shop, to show how a police car operates, to show their little world. And yes, some officers are concerned. If we show them, give them an opportunity to sit in the car, will they learn how our police car functions? And then when we're out on the street, they're going to do something horrible. Slow it down, turn it down just a minute, officer. Take the time to say, by you building this relationship with these young men and women today, you may be saving the life of an officer tomorrow, because the relationships that are done, built today have an effect. Look at what we have. We can have an event take place in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Los Angeles, move its way through social media and in minutes, find its way to be the predominant piece of information that youth are looking at. So turn those around to be positives, to allow for opportunities to take place. In short, I would say what I think are just the pros, the successes are just being in your local supermarket, commercial box store, and someone will say, Dr. Penn, you remember I was a TAP student back in 2014, 15. And you say, whoa, is this the same person? And that person is there as the checkout person, helping you with your bags, moving forward there, just moving in to be a productive member of society and not having that fear with officers, still having a guard up, but allowing themselves to be involved in the voting process, to be involved as a civic engagement that comes from perhaps what we provided, a small spark for that person. So the base hits making for the game-winning runs.
Thank you, Dr. Penn. I'm sure you could spend hours talking about the success stories and the wins that you and your colleagues have had through TAPS, and those kind of things make us really want to stay with what we're doing. You look like you've got something else to add.
And I sadly tell you, I've attended funerals. I mean, that's the reality of the work that we do. That I cannot tell you it's all wins. Sometimes we go to the locker room with a loss, and to attend a funeral of someone who has been the result of gun violence And then to hear in the back, when the funeral was taking place, his friends, his 5 or 10 friends saying, that not perhaps most respectfully at the funeral, saying, we're going to get them tonight. We know where we are. We know where they are. And just thinking how many cases, how many lives have been lost by that one is a reality that I have to live with and say, what more can we do to reduce that violence?
Well, it sounds like you're finding the motivation in every circumstance. You're using the wins to motivate you to go forward, and the losses also to find a way to do even better. So thank you. Dr. Kabina, somebody asked what I think is a great question, because I asked the same question in my classes. If you could, when you talked about the George Floyd Act, this question really goes towards that. If you could get Congress or the federal government to do just one thing to help reduce police use of force and improve police community relations in minority neighborhoods, what would that one thing be?
I appreciate that question. So this is in addition to the George Floyd Act, right? Okay. So, I mean, one of the things I would say, and I wasn't able to talk about it during the talk because of the limited time, but, part of the strained relationship between Black people and the police really had, again, it dates back all the way to the history and the legacy of slavery, right? And so there's always the question in terms of how do we bring about healing and improve police-community relationships. I think part of what needs to happen is, as a nation, we do need to engage in some truth-telling about harm that has actually been caused. In terms of America does need to be honest about the ways in which law enforcement has originated from slave patrols and taking responsibility for that pain or harm in unconditional ways, fully acknowledging, this is what happened. This is ways in which traditional policing has been harmful to communities without making excuses, without trying to justify such actions. And then there does need to be, I think, effort needs to be made to try to repair that harm, to ensure that there's non-occurrence of that harm. Can you guys hear me? I see someone said my audio needs attention. Can you hear me okay?
We're getting a little bit of feedback as you talk. I'm not sure why.
I'm sorry. So I think part of what needs to happen is definitely recognizing the pain and the harm and taking responsibility for that harm and making effort to repair that harm. As we talk about, or as we think about the violent history that the United States has, the U.S. is not the only country that has a violent history. Apartheid took place in South Africa. Genocide took place in Rwanda. We know that the Holocaust took place in Germany, but there's also been a commitment to truth and reconciliation in South Africa. Rwanda has also understood the necessity for transitional justice. So that is, measures are taken to try to redress some of the human rights abuse in order for there to be in order for healing to take place. And people who visit Berlin, Germany, will encounter stones and markers of Jewish families who were abducted and taken into concentration camps. These countries offer different ways, offer examples as to how we can move forward as a country. And I only bring that up because, the United States has yet to really publicly and systematically address this history and legacy of slavery. It looks like, are you guys having trouble hearing me?
A little bit. Jennifer, if you would turn your sound off and turn it back on again, we'll try that. In the meantime, I'm going to ask another question to Dr. Brunson. One panelist or one audience member asked about the need to train police and educate police. So we've talked some about selecting police, finding good people that can become police, but then within that, how do we train police to be to have the skills requisite to do the job, and particularly around communication? Police go into what is a militaristic culture, and then they find themselves indoctrinated into sort of a warrior mentality, and that brings in something from another question. So how do we cultivate that culture of communication?
And I often find myself starting my response with the commenting on one of my fellow panelists' comments as well. And I'll say that, broadly, one of the acknowledgements is that policing as a profession is a microcosm of our society, and that we also need to address the systemic racism that exists in our broader society, and that perhaps policing, given its traditions and customs and origins, maybe policing is functioning in the way it was intended, which is probably hard for us to acknowledge as well. So that also kind of speaks to what we need to do to reimagine policing and have the opportunity to do that in this current space where people are willing to have the dialogue. In terms of the training, again, I'm somewhat skeptical about training being the magic bullet, pardon the pun, but I think that it also allows us to look at the broader culture of policing, that if we don't address the foundational culture where, you know, we often have heard and seen in movies and televisions and accounts, then when recruits get out of the academy, the training officer said, forget everything you learned in the academy. So again, it kind of undermines the faith in which we could have in training if the culture overrides the training. So the short of it all is I think that we need to, we can do two things at one time. So we need to simultaneously address and evaluate training, but we also need to focus on the culture of policing that lends itself to allowing and encouraging some practices and incentivizes some practices as opposed to devaluing others. We don't hear enough about awards and accolades for good community service, but we do hear about, you know, other kind of heroic, and not to diminish those, but as a society, people will do what we cherish, value, and prioritize, and maybe they won't assess as much value on those things that we don't reward and value and prioritize.
Can I also add, can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we still have a little bit of buzzing. Sorry.
Okay, so should I not speak?
You can go ahead.
Okay, I think also part of, you know, trying to end this warrior mentality is, you know, is the need to also be aware of the role that militarization of the police can play, and also helping straining the relationship between police and civilians. You know, certainly police might have a legitimate need to use some military equipment and tactics in truly exceptional circumstances in order to try to keep the peace. But, you know, in practice, SWAT teams now are being used less in emergency situations or high-risk scenarios, like what we would envision, like hostage taking or acts of terrorism. And SWAT team deployments are now being used quite often for more routine police work, such as executing search warrants, particularly as it relates to drugs. In addition, you know, when officers have military equipment, what that does, it really, especially we saw this with protesters, it feeds a mindset that officers are not serving the community, but rather they are soldiers at war. And you know, again, in the case of protesters in Ferguson and Baltimore, and even in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, we saw that in some cases, officers were viewing protesters as the enemy, which certainly, again, all of this really erodes police legitimacy. I do also want to say that the Department of Justice, you know, they published their findings of its investigation in the aftermath in terms of how police officers responded to protesters in the aftermath of Michael Brown's death. And they found that the use of this quasi-military force against protesters antagonized the public. It also escalated tension between protesters and police, and at times it infringed on protesters' constitutional rights. And there's a number of studies that also show that the militarization of the police is typically disproportionately used in Black and Brown communities, and again, further damaging relationships with law enforcement. And so certainly it's plausible that, for instance, like SWAT deployment can deter violent crime. There are studies that also show that heavy-handed tactics have found little evidence of actually resulting in crime reduction. So I think just part of ending this warrior mentality is reducing or limiting certainly the militarization of the police.
Absolutely. And the best police are always like a used car salesperson. They can convince somebody to do something that is not in their best interest. If you go to a used car lot to buy a minivan and you walk away with a convertible sports car, you have been upsold. And that's what police have to do. They have to get people to let them be sometimes handcuffed, let them be put into a police car, or let them um, be talked into doing something that they don't want to do. And that takes patience, it takes communication skills, and it takes an understanding of that person's psychology, what they've come into that scenario with. The easiest thing for a police officer to do is to grab somebody, throw them down, and put their handcuffs on them. That takes very little skill. It takes very little effort. The hardest thing for a police officer to do is to talk to a person for an extended period of time and show that person the end that they need to achieve together. It's not easy, but that's what the best police can do. So those are the kinds of officers that agencies need to find and cultivate and promote and have them serve as models for other officers. So Dr. Penn, I have a question for you. One panelist or one audience member asked about enhancing police accountability, particularly around qualified immunity, and whether that or other steps would enhance officer accountability.
The simple answer to that is no one is above the law. That's the answer. There's no more to say. And although the police take on a very difficult task every single day, when one is wrong, one needs to be accountable for that wrong. So immunity does allow for that in circumstances to take place. But my simple answer is no one is above the law. And these associations we see between DAs, police officers, and associations, for example, in Ferguson, just cannot be. You've got to give an opportunity for the citizens to have faith in the system through procedural justice, if you would like to call it that there is an opportunity for fairness on the street. If I'm told to comply on the street, then I've got to believe that after coming out of the street circumstance, me following the directions given, that the court of law will allow me to have a chance. If that's not the case, you're going to have chaos. We don't want chaos. So you've got to give an opportunity to allow for the fair play to take place.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. It's a hard thing to achieve, but it's a goal that we all want to pursue. Dr. Brunson, somebody asked about your study in New York and how young people can be encouraged to come to police and tell police what they know about other people in their community. How can the youth be encouraged and supported by police to, well, provide police information that they need to effectively do their work?
And again, that's a great and thoughtful question, and it all hinges on relationships and building relationships. And one thing I'll say particularly about the study in New York is that this involved chronic repeat offenders. And so perhaps people who are not necessarily inclined to come forward with supporting and or as cooperating witnesses. So I want to make that clear that the study is skewed, as Dr. Penn spoke about, how they target high-risk individuals for inclusion in TAPS. This study purposely, at least the 50 that we focused on, were high-risk repeat offenders and probably not the easiest people to bring around to that orientation that it's helpful to cooperate with the police. But I think it starts early, and it starts with good interactions, positive interactions, and ones where you build trust over time and you damage it, quickly. And in some ways, in ways that aren't, that don't lend themselves to them being repaired. So I'd say if officers form those relationships of mutual trust and understanding and care, that it will promote the type of, we need witnesses to come forward to help the police in solving crime. And this wedge that has been driven between police and communities is particularly dangerous for people who live in high crime communities who need the police the most, perhaps. But they need a certain type of policing, not the heavy-handed as you talked about, Will, throwing people on the ground and handcuffing them, but certainly have elements of procedural justice where you recognize and respect the dignity, the human dignity of individuals.
Absolutely. Thank you. And the police are reliant on the community for effective policing. Absent the community's cooperation, police will always struggle to achieve their ends. And it's so critical to have trust, mutual trust, and that trust is so easily broken down. And that's one of the tragedies of modern policing. Um, One of the things we haven't discussed yet today is fair and impartial policing, the role of implicit bias and understanding implicit bias. We've talked some about the culture within policing. Some of the questions that we've seen through the chat were revolve around how police are expected to operate in a really difficult set of circumstances where lots of people look at them, sometimes justifiably in some cities, with distrust and with skepticism. How does how do the ideas of fair and impartial policing support police in modern day times? Dr. Penn, you work really closely with police all the time. Can you talk about how fair and impartial policing or the understanding implicit bias can help police move forward?
That is part of our training that we have for our police officers before they ever interact with any of the young men and women of TAPS Academy, is that you understand your social distance, you understand your biases, appreciate them, but understand you walk through life just as that youth does with these biases. The question is, know that you have the biases. What are you going to do about it? Are you further moving through life, moving those biases to be part of action, or are you trying your very best to sustain a lifestyle that does not continue to have those biases in what you do? So yes, training again is important, but also that live interaction with someone. Again, we know more about each other over these last 60, 90 minutes than we did beforehand. By us interacting with each other, we're allowing to see, we have a lot in common. We have more in common than we probably have different. The same thing happens with youth and citizens, police coming together to find, we may have come from different backgrounds, but we want the best for our families, for success. Why don't we work together to find those successes where police officers, members of the community are coming to talk and be those leaders along with the police officers, like I said, to move these youth forward. And the youth have the important job of moving these police officers forward. So they're not afraid to get out of their car. Community policing says, get out of the car. Community policing is not just that of a specialized unit. As Lee P. Brown, it is a philosophy for a police department. And now with 21st century policing, we're taking community policing further to make sure the most disenfranchised people receive that, not just those folks that love the police already and we're having milk and cookies with them, but those folks who hate the police because they don't understand the police or they've had negative experiences, allowing for them to come together, understand each other better. That's what procedural justice and these opportunities allow, 21st century policing.
That's a great answer. And I love the passion you bring with your answers. And I really appreciate all the work that each of you, Dr. Brunson, Dr. Penn, Dr. Cabina, this is more than just your presentation and the answers to the questions. This is your life work and all the work you've done with TAPS, all the research you've done all over the United States, Dr. Brunson, and Dr. Cabina, your work in Baltimore and St. Louis, Ferguson. The backgrounds that you each have developed informed your presentations today and your answers. And that made your presentations interesting and your answers exciting. There were many unanswered questions posed in the chat and posed in the Q&A process. And we just don't have time. We're up against our time limit now. We don't have time to answer all of them, which is too bad because I love hearing each of you talk. But I encourage audience members to contact each of these faculty directly. I posted their websites in the chat, and if you do a quick search, you can find them because they're all prominent researchers and they're connected to great universities. So I encourage you to pose questions on corrections, for example, to Dr. Cabina or Dr. Penn or any of them. You guys are all good. But if you have questions that we weren't able to address, please contact each of these faculty directly, and either they can answer them or they can point you to somebody they know who could answer your questions. So I want to thank each of you panelists for your time and effort. These are such important topics, and I hope that the presentations and discussion that we've had today has been edifying for audience. I know I've learned a lot. The entire presentation can be found on the Wilder School's YouTube channel. So please feel free to watch it again over and over, watch the parts that you want to see again, or recommend this to colleagues. I pasted the Wilder School's channel in the chat, so you should be able to find this. I want to thank CJRA and COSSA for sponsoring this event. I want to thank my dean, Susan Gooden, for her support. And I want to thank the Wilder School communication team, Tiffany Murray Robertson, and especially Katie Wynn for organizing things. I hope everyone stays well. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.